In this video, we'll be covering over the feud between John Veasey and John Ciancaglini. Both of these men have grew up in South Philadelphia in a predominant Italian neighborhood. And when they have crossed paths, many people have questioned their relationship and the dynamic. And now we will be breaking down both the history of these men, and there you can see the parallel histories between them. Let's start with John Veasey. John Veasey was born on May 15, 1966. As we mentioned before, he was born in South Philadelphia in a predominant family. He had an estranged relationship with his father, but had a warm relationship with his mother. He was the youngest child of his parents, and they had 5 children. And as the baby, you'd think he'd be spoiled, but he, along with his siblings, had grew up in the very rough, mean streets of South Philadelphia. His mother had sold crystal meth out of our family's bakery. By his mid-teens, he was a junkie and the father of 2 by his early 20s. And he had been arrested for more than 60 times. However, John Veasey did not really have inspiration to join the mafia until he met a special member of the Cosa Nostra to start a payday for $10,000 to put on a hit. Now that man will be Frank Martinez, who John Veasey had offered to pay him to put out his very first contract on a broad daylight that will occur in a future story that we will cover soon. Now we need to get to John Ciancaglini. John Ciancaglini, just like Veasey, also was born in Philadelphia on October 5, 1955, and he had royal mob ties in his blood. Son of Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini, who was a respected criminal underworld figure and had worked with Nicky Scarfo as the mob capo for several years and was a very legitimate tough guy. Many people describe him as strong as an ox and a very lovable personality. Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini was a real legitimate tough guy, and he was known for having 3 sons and will all be respected figures in the Philadelphia public. His oldest son will be John Ciancaglini, also known as Johnny Chang. His middle son would bear his name, Joseph Joey Ciancaglini Jr., and then his youngest, Michael Ciancaglini, better known as Mikey Chang. And all of Joseph Ciancaglini's sons will be known as the Chang brothers, or the Ciancaglini brothers, whichever you prefer to say. John Ciancaglini grew up alongside his younger brothers, Joey and Michael. From a young age, they all engaged in the criminal activities with their childhood friend, Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino. Following in the footsteps of his father, John Ciancaglini began extorting local drug dealers on behalf of the crime family, being arrested in 1988 and sentenced to several years in prison. During his stint in custody, the mob became embroiled in an internal conflict which created a split between the Ciancaglini brothers, with Joey joining boss John Stanfa, whose real name is Giovanni Stanfa, while Michael remained loyal to his friend Joseph Merlino and his rebellion faction. So on one hand, you have Joe Ciancaglini Jr. siding with John Stanfa against the rebellious team that's led by Joseph Merlino and Michael Ciancaglini. Therefore, there has become an eternal conflict war within the Philadelphia crime family. However, John Ciancaglini is not in this picture, as he and his father are already in prison for other different criminal activities. Meanwhile, his siblings are at war in the 1990s while he and his father were in prison. On March 2nd, 1993, at the Warford Luncheon Express, Joseph Ciancaglini was opening up his restaurant at 6:30 a.m. and gunmen, as you can see in the footage, have shown up and gunned him down.
Look closely. You are witnessing a mob hit in progress. 3 hitmen are entering this Philadelphia diner armed with handguns. As the gunmen leave, they take one last look at their victim, who lies bleeding on the floor. Then they jump in a waiting car. No one is ever charged, but everyone agrees it was a mob hit.
Joseph Ciancaglini Jr. survives, but he's permanently incapacitated. Word on the street was many people suspect that it was the rival faction that was led by Joihn Merlino, and the allegations have been soaring even to this day, but Merlino and none of his entourage has never been convicted for that shooting. In the following months, on August 5th, 1993, 5 months later after the shooting of Joseph Ciancaglini Jr., on 6th and Catherine Street, Joseph Skinny Joy Merlino and Mikey Chang Ciancaglini were minding their business outside the club of a social diner on 6th and Catherine. Unbeknownst to them, as they were minding their business, two gunmen are doing a drive-by shooting. First, the gunman had hesitated and drove around when he witnessed that his brother was a part of the conversation between Merlino and Ciancaglini. So they circled back around until they realized that the other member was gone. And the next thing you know, as the car stopped and pulled, Joseph Merlino and Michael Ciancaglini were gunned down, shot multiple times from a drive-by shooting. At the time of this news, this would become a big media sensation in the South Philadelphia region, creating big hostile tensions and making people concerned about their safety in the roar of South Philadelphia. Joseph Skinny Joy Merlino took a shot to the buttocks, while Michael Ciancaglini had tried to cover his face, but however he was shot through the arm that led towards his heart, and Michael Ciancaglini was mortally wounded. Joy Merlino had accompanied his friend and tried to get him into a hospital as best as he could while battling his own injuries. However, he did not know that his own friend would die within his arms minutes apart. The gunmen eventually were become informants, and they were working underneath the Stanfa regime. The driver turned informant was Philip Coletti, and the shooter would also be an informant, and that was John Veasey. Following the orders of their boss, John Stanfa, and this would become the contract that John Stanfa had ordered on the price of Merlino for retaliation for the shooting that happened to Joseph Ciancaglini Jr. The person who introduced John Veasey to the Philadelphia crime family was Frank Martinez, and Frank Martinez was the acting underboss under John Stanfa once Joseph Ciancaglini Jr. was no longer able to fulfill that role. So Frank Martinez replaced Joseph Ciancaglini Jr. and therefore offered the contract to John Veasey under the orders of John Stanfa, which will be the firepower. John Veasey, on an interview of 60 Minutes, said that when Frank Martinez gave him the proposition, he was supposed to be $10,000 for the pay hit that occurred on Merlino and Ciancaglini. However, he never received the money. And when John Veasey had been vocal towards his boss, John Stanfa, that did not sit well with John Stanfa. This time he put a hit on John Veasey. So on January 14th, 1994, John Veasey was walking his dog until a car pulls up along beside him. In the car was Frank Martinez and Vincent Alpajamas Pagano. They said they had a business to discuss. They took him right here, specifically on the South Philadelphia building, as we discussed in the previous videos. While Veasey was curious to exactly what occurred, and they had business discussed, he knows there was plastic on the floor, and he was already an informant, but he was not wearing his wire during the time. He was shot in the head multiple times by Frank Martinez as Vincent Alpajamas Pagano watched. However, Veasey had fought his attackers, escaping by leading to punching them, stabbing them, and letting himself free outside the venue, fighting for his life. So the failed mob hip did not work against Veasey, and this made him more of a legendary figure in the criminal underworld outside of the Merlino and Ciancaglini hit. The fact that he survived his own potential hit shows how much powerful he is, despite many people not liking him for him being a government informant. Meanwhile, after all the violence and brewing, John Ciancaglini was released from prison in the early 2000s and also had to hear the stories about both the loss of his brother Michael Ciancaglini and his brother Joseph Ciancaglini Jr. being disabled for the rest of his life. Many people from news media, criminal underworld figures, and more were questioning who would John Ciancaglini align himself with. Will he align himself with the men who took the life of his brother? Will he get revenge? Will he side with Joseph Skinny Joe Merlino, which he's been alleged to disable one of his brothers? Or will he side with John Stanfa, who put the contract on murdering his own brother Michael Ciancaglini? Now, law enforcement has believed that John Ciancaglini had aligned himself with Joihn Merlino and Ralph Natali. As you can hear this from George Stanfa making this similar confirmation.
And at this point, John Ciancaglini, the oldest Ciancaglini brother, is now out of prison. He's in a position where he's got to choose which faction to align himself with. Does he align himself with the faction that killed his brother Mikey, and which his brother Joey belongs to, or does he align himself with the faction that crippled his brother Joey, but that was aligned with his brother Mikey? Now, the feds allege that John Ciancaglini chose to line up behind Joey Merlino and Ralph Natale.
So after John Veasey survived his mob hit, he will also have to deal with his own brother, who was trying to make peace with the Philadelphia crime members, knowing that his safety was in jeopardy. It was Billy Veasey who helped John Veasey to cooperate with law enforcement in fear for his own brother's life. However, on October 5th, 1995, Billy Veasey, after he left his home, was headed toward work, and two gunmen who came up near the block where his car approached shot his vehicle, and then he would succumb to his injuries. The same day, on October 5th, 1995, while John Stanfa and his entourage were indicted in 1994, he would go on trial in 1995. And while on that day, John Veasey was supposed to testify, that's when he lost his brother. Now, law enforcement at the time believed it was possible that John Ciancaglini could have been involved. However, John Ciancaglini still maintains the defense's innocence regarding the accusation. Now, this is where more tensions has built up between these two men. So John Veasey believes that John Ciancaglini was involved in the hit on Billy Veasey. However, John Ciancaglini, along with Merlino, were accused of other different federal charges, including murder, racketeering, and so forth. During that infamous trial, John Ciancaglini will be acquitted for the murder of Billy Veasey. However, John Veasey is still convinced that John Ciancaglini was involved. But we will show you a news clip when John Ciancaglini was on trial for the hit on Billy Veasey, as you can see here.
On this final day of testimony, defendant John Ciancaglini took the stand. He denied killing Billy Veasey in 1995 in retaliation for the murder of his own brother, Michael. Michael Ciancaglini died at the hands of hitman-turned-government witness John Veasey. Billy Veasey was shot to death on the morning his brother, John Veasey, was to take the stand in another mob trial. Ciancaglini testified that Billy Veasey apologized for the actions of his brother John, that he, Ciancaglini, and Billy Veasey shook hands. Government attorney Barry Gross tried to paint a different picture.
Isn't it true that you had an argument with Billy Veasey the day before he was killed?
I never had an argument with Billy Veasey, Mr. Gross. Never.
Isn't it true you told him that he would never see his brother take the stand?
I never said that, Mr. Gross. Never. Stop insinuating things.
John Ciancaglini served 9 years for extortion and conspiracy and was in jail for most of the bloody mob wars of the early and mid-90s. He denies being a mob member and said he didn't know bosses Ralph Natale or Nicky Scarfo. But the government tried to bring Ciancaglini's credibility into question by showing the jury a 1986 photograph of John Ciancaglini with Scarfo at Scarfo's vacation home in Florida.
Identify the people in that picture, please. That's me on the right and Nicky Scarfo on the left.
The defense tried to show the jury that Ciancaglini just tagged along for the trip to Florida with his brother.
As we mentioned before, John Ciancaglini was acquitted for the Billy Veasey hit. And after all these years, he still maintains his innocence and is minding his business as we speak. And he's been very quiet and very low-key about all the other different activities that involves the Philadelphia crime family. He minds his business. He once worked for a newspaper stand that many people believe that his wife owned, and has been maintaining peace for many years ever since the whole problems that occurred in the 80s and 90s. Meanwhile, after John Veasey had crushed John Stanfa in the criminal trial, John Stanfa, along with his other criminal associates, were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. John Veasey had to go to jail for some of his criminal activities as well. He's been married, is a churchgoer, and has been selling cars for a living. And he lives under a pseudonym in the middle of America that is undisclosed since he is still a government witness. John Ciancaglini, on the other hand, has still not cooperated with law enforcement and maintains his innocence of other different criminal accusations. John Veasey has been harassing John Ciancaglini and his wife Kathy Ciancaglini, as you can see here.
His brother's murder almost 20 years ago has remained an obsession. We learned that on visits to Philadelphia, Veasey has made threats against those he thinks were responsible. Kathy Ciancaglini says she's been a target for years.
It's frightening, it's aggravating, it's intimidating.
Why would John Veasey threaten you?
He believes that my husband has killed his brother.
Her husband, John Ciancaglini, and others were tried in 2001 for the murder of Billy Veasey and found not guilty. But John Veasey maintains Ciancaglini did murder Billy as payback for his first hit when he killed Ciancaglini's brother, Michael. Kathy says Veasey has posted menacing pictures on Facebook and left her voicemails that she saved, like this one from 2011.
I don't give a if I get caught. I will get you, John. How's your wife feel about that? Maybe I'll hit her in the too. You punk.
He's the punk. He threatens me. Calls my husband a punk. He's the punk. He threatens women. That's what.
So as you heard, John Veasey in the 2010s at the time of this 60 Minutes interview was harassing the Ciancaglini family. However, in the aftermath of certain interviews, his interview with Dave Stratweiser, he has now apologized to the people that he has hurt, and he's wrote a book with Ralph Cipriano. The book that you can find on Amazon is called The Hitman, A True Story of Murder, Redemption at the Melrose Diner. So as we mentioned, he wrote a book called The Hitman, A True Story of Murder, Redemption at Melrose Diner that he co-authored with Ralph Cipriano. And is now living, and as we mentioned before, John Veasey is living in the middle of America and has not done any interviews since the 2010s. Meanwhile, John Ciancaglini last year in the 2020s was brought up in the news cycle along with his wife for the Chicky and Pete's brawl. How did the fight occur? Many people have different stories and conflicts. John Ciancaglini and his wife Kathy Ciancaglini have been freed ever since that whole media sensation has occurred. After the confliction with John Veasey, meanwhile, John Ciancaglini and his wife have been living their lives and then also accompanied Joihn Molino when it came to the opening of his cheesesteak shop, the Skinny Joey's Cheesesteak. The Ciancaglini family helped support Molino at Skinny Joey's Cheesesteak in the middle of South Philly and have been minding their business and have been enjoying their lives in the sunset. In the meantime, this has been the history and feud between John Veasey and Johnny Ciancaglini. If you'd like to hear more stories, please subscribe to our channel, Infantry Productions, and we would like to hear from your opinions in the comment section below. This is Infantry Productions. Stay tuned.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and check out more of our content. Feel free to give your feedback and suggestions on what we should do next in the comments. This is Infinite Lee Productions. We love ya.